It's good to see you back again. We are definitely in the final stretch. We have 2 more sessions together, and then of course we have the glorious baptism coming up, the first baptism here at Secrets Unsealed. So those who are going to be baptized are pioneers. And then of course we have a testimony period, and then after that we have a light meal. Did you get enough to eat for lunch today? Yes. Probably more than you needed, right? At least I did. But I'm not going to go to sleep, but you might. Anyway, it's good to see you back. This afternoon we are going to dedicate the first hour to finishing the reasons why I believe that we are not required to keep the feasts. Now, it doesn't mean that the meaning of the feasts we should not study. We should certainly study the meaning of the feasts, but we are not required to fulfill the specific details of their observance. Now, we are going to begin with a review on page 241 of your syllabus, where the title is The Statutes and the Ceremonial Law. And I'm just going to review the points that we covered in our last session yesterday. And that is that the statutes, it is true that the feasts are called statutes, but the word statutes bears a closer relationship with the 10 Commandments than it bears with the ceremonial law. And we dealt with that yesterday. And I also recommended that you read that particular article by Ellen White, where she remarks about the relationship between the ceremonial law and the statutes. The next point that we covered was on page 246. And here we notice that the Gentiles were not commanded to keep the feasts. At the Jerusalem Council, the issue was not only circumcision, the issue was also the command to keep the law of Moses. So it was broader than just circumcision. And there's no evidence whatsoever that God at that council commanded the Gentiles to observe the Hebrew feasts. Then on page 247, we also noticed that there were sacrifices connected with the feasts. And what feast skippers say is that, well, you know, we can offer a spiritual sacrifice. We can offer ourselves as a spiritual sacrifice. But there's no place in the Bible where it says that a spiritual sacrifice can take the place of a literal sacrifice. And you can't separate the sacrifices from the other observances that are linked with the sacrifices. We also noted that all males 12 years and older were commanded to go to Jerusalem at least for 3 of these feasts, the harvest feasts. And of course, today we can't travel to Jerusalem, to the temple, to celebrate those feasts. So why can we bypass that requirement and have to fulfill other requirements related to the feasts? And then we have the word forever or the word perpetual. You know, feast keepers say, well, we're told that the feasts are perpetual. The feasts are forever. Well, we already noticed that the word forever does not necessarily mean endless, without end. The word forever is used for a long, indefinite period of time that at the end does come to a conclusion. So just because the word perpetual or forever is used in conjunction with the feasts doesn't mean that they're to last beyond the death and the resurrection of Christ, beyond his intercession on Pentecost, etc. We also noticed that the way in which the feasts are kept today by feast keepers many times is based on their own traditions. Because is there any prescription in the Bible on how to celebrate the feasts without the sacrifices? How much of the feast you should celebrate, how much of them you should not celebrate? You know, do we offer barley today? Do we offer wheat today? We don't do any of those things. And yet those are an integral part of the feasts. So why can we choose to implement some things concerning the feasts and not others? What we do would be based only on our own what? Would be based on our own tradition and not on the thus saith the Lord. Then we notice also that these are agricultural feasts. The cycle is based on the year of agriculture. It's based on the barley harvest at the time of Passover, on the feast of wheat on the day of Pentecost, and the fruit harvest at the end of the year. So how do people who live in other parts of the world where there's not a semi-tropical, subtropical climate, how would they observe the feasts? How would they bring a sheaf of barley? How would they bring, 2 loaves of wheat? Do they go to the supermarket and buy the wheat and not from their field? See, you have the problem, once again, of observing the feast the way the person thinks it should be observed, rather than by a direct command of the Lord. And then last time, we were dealing with the Sabbath and the feasts. And that is on page 250 of your syllabus. And I want to go back again to what we dealt with at the end of our class last time, because, I don't want to just start in the middle. So let's begin at the top of the page, the Sabbath and the feasts. There's a fundamental difference between the seventh-day Sabbath and the feasts. God established the Sabbath when? At creation, before sin. And therefore, it is perpetually binding upon all human beings. Not so with the ceremonial law. When God created the heavens and the earth, there was no need of sacrifices or feasts to commemorate or to prefigure anything. The Bible is clear that the feasts originated at Mount Sinai. In fact, the first feast, Passover, was to remind Israel of the first step in their journey from Egypt to Canaan. The feasts are connected with literal Israel and their particular history. In contrast, God gave the Sabbath to the entire human race at Mount Sinai, but it existed long before Mount Sinai. It's eternal. The Sabbath is part of the Ten Commandments, and the feasts are part of the book that the priests placed beside the Ark of the Covenant. The fourth commandment bears no relationship to the agricultural year, but rather follows the weekly cycle of 7 days that is determined by the rising and the setting of the sun. This has something to say to those who keep the Sabbath according to a lunar rather than a solar calendar. Ellen White clearly and repeatedly refers to the Sabbath as a solar observance, not a lunar one. So is there a distinction between the feasts and the Sabbath with regards to when they are supposed to be celebrated? Yes. The feasts are marked by the moon, whereas the Sabbath and the days are marked by the sun. There's a radical distinction between both. I'm not going to read all these statements that we read yesterday, but Ellen White is explicit in these statements that the day is determined by the rising and setting of the sun, and the week is based on that as well. The top of page 251, the Sabbath is a weekly celebration, while the feasts were yearly ones. The Sabbath was not a shadow, but the feasts are a shadow. Although it is true that the Sabbath secondarily commemorated redemption from Egypt, it was still a weekly celebration, and its observance was determined by the sun, not by the moon. The Sabbath took on a secondary function after sin and pointed to the rest of redemption. So just because the Sabbath takes on a secondary function and points to redemption doesn't mean that the Sabbath is one of the feasts, or it should be celebrated according to the moon. Now, those who observe the feasts have referred to Leviticus 23, 1 through 4. Here we enter new territory, as proof for feast keeping. These verses seem to indicate that the Sabbath was one of the feasts. Feast keepers argue that if we are still required to keep the seventh-day Sabbath, and the Sabbath is one of the feasts, then we must also keep the feasts. Let's read Leviticus chapter 23, verses 1 through 5, actually verse 1 through 4, where you find this passage that feast keepers use. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, The feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, these are my feasts. And of course, this would be Jesus speaking, right? To whom do the feasts belong? Do the feasts belong to the Jews? No. They are whose calendar? The feasts are Jesus' calendar, right? They are Messiah's calendar. And so we shouldn't be surprised that Jesus calls them, these are my feasts, because they point to events in his particular ministry. And then in verse 3, you have a reference to the Sabbath. It says, 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. And then you'll notice after the mention of the Sabbath, once again it mentions the feasts. It says in verse 4, These are the feasts of the Lord, holy convocations which you shall proclaim at their appointed times. And so the argument is, the Sabbath is sandwiched with the feasts, because the first part of the passage says, These are the feasts of the Lord. Then the Sabbath is mentioned, and then once again we find the expression, These are my feasts, or these are the feasts of the Lord. But really, the Sabbath here is a parenthetical statement. It means besides the Sabbaths of the Lord, you are supposed to keep the feasts. And you say, where do you get that idea from? We get it from the end of the chapter. Chapter 23 and verses 37 and 38 make a distinction between the feasts and the ceremonial observance of the feasts and the observance of the Sabbath. Notice verse 37, where you have the concluding verse concerning the feasts. These are the feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, to offer an offering made by fire to the Lord, a burnt offering and a grain offering, a sacrifice and drink offerings, everything on its day. Now, notice this. Besides the Sabbaths of the Lord. So are the Sabbaths of the Lord included in the feasts? No. Besides the Sabbaths of the Lord, besides your gifts, besides all your vows, and besides all your free will offerings which you give to the Lord. So basically, the Sabbath is a parenthetical statement. When you go to the end of chapter 23, that becomes clear, because it says you shall keep the feasts besides the Sabbaths of the Lord. One further consideration. There's a distinction between the seventh-day Sabbath and the rest of the ceremonial Sabbaths. You see, on the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath, no work was to be done. But when it comes to the feasts, it says, no servile or regular work shall you do on the Sabbath. Of course, with the exception of the Day of Atonement. The solemn Day of Atonement was to be kept as the seventh-day Sabbath. But there is a distinction between the manner of observing the ceremonial Sabbaths and the manner of observing the seventh-day Sabbath. Now, the next argument in page 252 is that Genesis 1 verse 14 is used to say that the feasts existed at creation. You see, feast keepers, they're not willing to admit that the feasts originated at Mount Sinai. They say that the feasts existed even before sin came into the world. And they use Genesis 1:14 and Psalm 104 and verse 19 to refer or to try and prove this point. What they say is that the word seasons in Genesis 1:14 is a technical term that refers to the feasts. And therefore, the feasts already existed in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 14 when God created the heavenly luminaries. Let's read the passage, and you tell me if you find anything here that says we're supposed to celebrate Passover on unleavened bread. Why would you celebrate Passover? There was no need of a Redeemer. Why would you celebrate unleavened bread? Jesus wasn't going to rest in the tomb yet. There was no need for him to rest in the tomb. Why would you have a feast pointing to the beginning of his intercessory ministry if there was no sin? Are you understanding what I'm saying? Now, notice, let's read this passage, Genesis 1:14 through 19. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons." See, there's the key word that they say. This is a technical term that refers to the feasts. "And seasons, and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth." And it was so. Then God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. God set them in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good, so evening and morning were the fourth day. So what is the argument here? In the Old Testament, the word seasons is most often used to describe an appointed place where some event had to occur. In a lesser sense, it is used to describe an appointed time for an event to occur. And you can go to Strong's Concordance or go to an online concordance, and you can corroborate what I'm saying. Most of the time, this word that is translated seasons or appointed, it's referring to an appointed place for an event to occur. Sometimes it is used to speak about the feasts. However, it is not used exclusively to refer to the feasts. For example, it's used to describe the set time at which Sarah was to bear Isaac. It refers to the set time for the fulfillment of prophetic events. It refers to the time of the year when the vintage harvest was to be gathered in. And it also refers to the specific time when birds were to migrate. So just because it is used for the feasts doesn't mean that in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 14, it's talking about the feasts. The heavenly bodies simply were meant to mark specific times of the year, months, seasons, etc. Now, it is not sound biblical practice to take the word in Leviticus 23 verse 2 and argue its meaning back into Genesis 1:14. Genesis is not referring to the feasts at all. It is simply saying that God made the heavenly bodies to divide light from darkness and to determine the seasons of the year. We must consider each text within its particular context. In Genesis, in Leviticus 23, the context is the cultic calendar or the ceremonial system. But in the context of Genesis 1, as well as Psalm 104, the context is the creation of the heavenly bodies to mark days, months, and seasons. God created the moon to determine the month, and He established the sun to determine the day. Later, God used the moon to determine the time for the cultic festivals. But it is illegitimate to argue the festivals back into Genesis 1:14, as if it was God's original intention. Some Adventists even go so far as to say that a lunisolar calendar should determine when we observe the weekly Sabbath. And they argue somewhat like this. And in our next session, we're going to deal with this specific point. Genesis 1:14 and Psalm 104 and verse 19 link the word seasons with the lunar cycle. And we would admit that, right? The word seasons in Genesis 1:14 is referring to the lunar cycle. Leviticus 23 includes the Sabbath in the category of the seasons. This is the way they argue. Therefore, the Sabbath, like the feasts, was determined by the lunar cycle. Are you understanding this circular reasoning? that they're using? For several reasons, this reasoning is flawed. First, the Jews have kept the Sabbath on our Saturday for thousands of years, and the sequence of days has never changed. Amen. Second, Ellen White and the pioneers kept the same Sabbath that we do. It is inconceivable that God would leave the remnant church in the dark on this matter from its inception until recent times. It is beyond belief that God would allow His remnant church to keep the wrong day of the week from 1846 until relatively recent times. If the Sabbath is so important, would God allow the remnant church to go for well over 100 years keeping the wrong day? The sequence of the days in Luke 23:54 through 24 verse 1 indicates that Jesus was crucified on Friday, He rested in the tomb on Sabbath, and He resurrected the first day of the week. Ellen White is clear on this point. I'm going to read only a part of this statement that we find here. Manuscript Releases, Volume 3, pages 425 and 426. In the middle of this statement we find, it was in God's plan that the work which Christ had engaged to do should be completed when? On a Friday. What part of Friday don't we understand? Would be completed on a Friday. And that on Sabbath, He should rest in the tomb, and there's a significance to that. Even as the Father and the Son had rested after completing their creative work. The hour of Christ's apparent defeat was the hour of His victory. The great plan, devised before the foundations of the earth were laid, was successfully carried out. Is there any doubt that Ellen White believed in the Friday crucifixion? No doubt. That Jesus rested in the tomb all day Sabbath? Absolutely. That Jesus resurrected on the first day of the week? No doubt whatsoever. A seminary professor was correct when he wrote these following words. The fact that the function of the moon begins on the fourth day of creation week, makes it impossible to identify the Sabbath coming 3 days later as a moon day. Are you understanding his argument? Devastating, because the moon was made on the fourth day. So where do you begin the sabbatical cycle? On the fourth day? Or do you believe it, do you do it the way the Bible says, beginning with the first day, the first solar day? I think the answer is self-explanatory. Now, did Paul keep the feasts? Some festivals that are mentioned in the book of Acts are simply meant to give us a time frame for the occurrence of certain events. In other words, this took place at Passover season, but they're not related to any command to observe that particular feast. As we have previously noted, Ellen White stated that it would be an insult to celebrate the Passover when the Lord's Supper has replaced it. Do you remember that statement that we read? Explicit, clear. The question is this: would the Apostle Paul insult Jehovah by teaching that the celebration of the Passover is mandatory for Christians? The book of Acts does not make the celebration of the feasts a test of fellowship, nor does it command people to keep them. There is no evidence whatever of Gentiles keeping the feasts, except perhaps the Galatians, whom Paul rebuked for keeping them. Paul did offer sacrifices in the temple, according to Acts 21:17-26. Obviously, the Apostle Paul was not offering those sacrifices thinking that they pointed forward to the death of Christ. That would be absurd. He allowed for Timothy to be circumcised also. And he did tarry at Philippi to spend Passover with the church. In fact, let me read Acts of the Apostles 3:90 and 3:91. Did Paul go there because he says, it is mandatory for me to celebrate the Passover? If he did, he insulted Jehovah, according to what we read. What is it that replaces the Passover? It's the communion service. Did the Apostle Paul speak of the communion service? Yes, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, doesn't he? He reviews what happened on the night that the communion service was established. So he knew that communion takes the place of the Passover. Why did Paul go to Philippi and celebrate the Passover with these people? We might catch a glimpse of the reason why in Acts of the Apostles 3:90 and 3:91. At Philippi, Paul tarried to keep the Passover. Only Luke remained with him, the other members of the company passing on to Troas to await him there. The Philippians were the most loving and true-hearted of the apostles' converts. And during the 8 days of the feast, he enjoyed what? Peaceful and happy communion with them. What was the main reason why he wanted to be there with the Philippians? Because they were the most loving. He wanted to have communion with them. It wasn't because he believed that the celebration of the Passover was mandatory. Now let's go to Acts chapter 18 and verses 18 through 21. It says here, and this gives the impression that the Apostle Paul felt that it was mandatory to keep the feast of Passover in Jerusalem. Notice what it says in Acts 18, beginning with verse 18. So Paul still remained a good while. Then he took leave of the brethren and sailed for Syria, and Priscilla and Aquila were with him. He had his hair cut off at Cenchrea, for he had taken a vow, and he came to Ephesus and left them there. But he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. What do you suppose he reasoned with the Jews about? What would be the reason? Well, he wanted to show them, like it says in the rest of the book of Acts, that Jesus was what? The Messiah. Notice verse 20. When they asked him to stay a longer time with them, he did not consent, but took leave of them, saying, I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem, but I will return again to you, God willing. And he sailed from Ephesus. So feast keepers say, this indicates without any doubt that the Apostle Paul felt it was a moral obligation to keep the Passover. However, this creates difficulties. As we noted, Ellen White stated that to keep the Passover after Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper would be an insult to Jehovah. Would Paul insult Jehovah by keeping the Passover because he felt that it was mandatory? Paul cannot contradict Paul. In Colossians 2 and Galatians 4, Paul clearly points out that the ceremonial observances were shadows of things to come. And Ellen White, as we have read, quotes Colossians 2 to this effect. Two considerations would help us avoid a seeming conflict between Paul's counsel and Paul's practice. First, this is a very important point. It will be noticed that in recent translations of the Bible, the phrase, I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem, is missing. You know, you look at all of the modern versions, this part of the verse is missing, where the Apostle Paul says, I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem. Why is it missing? There is textual evidence that this phrase was not part of the original text. Second, Paul followed a specific principle when he did his utmost to reach different cultures. I believe that the principle behind Paul's observance of some of the feasts can be found in 1 Corinthians 9, verses 19 through 22. He stated, for though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win the Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without the law, as without the law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without the law. Speaking about the Jewish law, the law that the Jews had. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you. So it's most likely that the Apostle Paul went to the celebration of these feasts so that he could take advantage of the opportunity to witness to these individuals, and so that they would not accuse him of totally forsaking the roots of his religion. In fact, when you go to the end of the book of Acts, the Apostle Paul says to these Roman rulers, he says, I have done nothing but follow what is in the writings of Moses and what is in the Scriptures. Now, Herbert Douglass wrote this about the Apostle Paul. He knew of the impending destruction of Jerusalem, the temple, and the soon termination of the Jewish ritual system. Time was swiftly running out for the Jews, and it was not unreasonable that he and other Jewish Christians looking for practical evangelistic opportunities to maximize their prospective audience. The feast celebrations would be the ideal platform to proclaim Christ's great antitypical sacrifice and high priestly ministry, the meaning and significance of the 6 annual celebrations. So it'd be a golden opportunity to take advantage of the feast to teach people how these feasts were fulfilled in Jesus Christ. Ellen White explains that even after the death and resurrection and ascension of Christ, the Christians were very slow in understanding that all of this system had come to an end. In a rather long passage, which I'm going to read because it's loaded with important information, Acts of the Apostles, page 189 and 190, Ellen White wrote this: the Jewish converts generally were not inclined to move as rapidly as the providence of God opened the way. From the result of the apostles' labors among the Gentiles, it was evident that the converts among the latter people would far exceed the Jewish converts in number. The Jews feared that if the restrictions and ceremonies of their law were not made obligatory upon the Gentiles as a condition of church fellowship, the national peculiarities of the Jews, which had hitherto kept them distinct from all other people, would finally disappear from among those who received the gospel message. Are you understanding what she's saying? The Jews had always prided themselves upon their divinely appointed services, and many of those who had been converted to the faith of Christ still felt that since God had once clearly outlined the Hebrew manner of worship, it was improbable that he would ever authorize a change in any of its specifications. They insisted that the Jewish laws and ceremonies, and it's not only the sacrifice, folks, they insisted that the Jewish laws and ceremonies should be incorporated into the rites of the what? Of the Christian religion. They were slow to discern that all the sacrificial offerings had but prefigured the death of the Son of God, in which type met antitype, and after which the rites and ceremonies of the Mosaic dispensation were no longer binding. Before his conversion, Paul had regarded himself as blameless, touching the righteousness which is in the law. However, since his change of heart, he had gained a clear conception of the mission of the Savior as the Redeemer of the entire race. Gentile as well as Jew had learned the difference between a living faith and a dead formalism. In the light of the gospel, the ancient rites and ceremonies committed to Israel had gained a new and deeper significance. That which they shadowed forth had come to pass, and those who were living under the gospel dispensation had been what? Freed from their observance. God's unchangeable law of 10 commandments, however, Paul still kept in spirit as well as in letter. It bears noting that the Apostle John, You know, John wrote his gospel and the book of Revelation as well as his epistles at the very end of the first century. This is significant. He never refers to the Hebrew feasts as Christian festivals. He refers to them simply as celebrations of the Jews. And the book of Revelation and the epistles, you find the same thing, and they were written at the end of the first century. On the other hand, neither John nor any other apostle referred to the weekly Sabbath as the Sabbath of the Jews. But constantly in his gospel, he says the feast of the Jews, the feast of the Jews, because he understood that these feasts applied to the Jewish nation until Messiah came to fulfill these prescriptions. Another argument that is used is that Jesus attended the feasts. It's clear that Jesus did attend some of the feasts. For example, John 2, verse 23, the Passover. John chapter 7, the Feast of Tabernacles. However, he attended these feasts with the purpose of encouraging people to look to him as the fulfillment of these feasts. We find, for example, and we've studied this before, in John 7, 37 to 39, where Jesus reminded those present that he was the rock from which the water gushed forth. He applied this historical episode to himself and to the outpouring of the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost. At the same feast, Jesus announced that he was the light of the world, thus alluding to the emphasis on light in the Feast of Tabernacles. So why would Jesus go to the feasts? Well, first of all, he was a Jew, and they hadn't been fulfilled yet. They would be fulfilled. So as a good Jew, he would be keeping the feasts. However, there's another reason, and that is that Jesus would take advantage of the opportunity to say, hey, you have this water ceremony at the Feast of Tabernacles, come to me and drink. Hey, you have the emphasis on light at this time of the year, I am the light of the world. So Jesus had the intention of drawing their attention to himself through the observance of these feasts. And of course, we know that when Jesus was 12 years old, he also amazed the religious leaders by the questions that he asked about the death of the Messiah, just awakening their interest in himself in the fulfillment of the Feast of Passover, more specifically in the death of the Messiah. Clearly, Jesus attended the feasts for a very specific evangelistic purpose. He was intent on leading the people to look to him as the fulfillment of the rites and ceremonies of the Hebrew economy. No doubt, this was the same reason why the Apostle Paul attended the feasts. What a golden opportunity it was to preach Jesus as the fulfillment of their entire ritual system. Another thing needs to be taken into account, and that is if Jesus is our example in feast keeping, he was not a very good example. You say, why is that? Because Jesus was absent from some of the feasts. Notice this statement from Desire of Ages, page 450. As the sons of Joseph made preparation to attend the Feast of Tabernacles, they saw that Christ made no movement signifying his intention of attending. They watched him with anxiety. Was this a requirement for Jesus to go? According to Hebrew law, was this a requirement? Of course it was a requirement. It was required by Jewish law. So if he's going to give us a good example, he would have had to have gone, right? So she says, they watched him with anxiety. Since the healing at Bethesda, he had not attended the national gatherings. To avoid useless conflict with the leaders at Jerusalem, he had restricted his labors to Galilee. His apparent neglect of the great religious assemblies and the enmity manifested toward him by the priests and rabbis were a cause of perplexity to the people about him, and even to his own disciples and his kindred. In his teachings, he had dwelt upon the blessings of obedience to the law of God, and yet he himself seemed to be indifferent to the service which had been divinely established. Is that clear? There's another statement, Desire of Ages, 451 and 452. From Jerusalem, the report of Christ's miracles had spread wherever the Jews were dispersed. And although for many months he had been absent from the feasts, the interest in him had not abated. Many from all parts of the world had come up to the Feast of Tabernacles in the hope of seeing him. At the beginning of the feast, many inquiries were made for him. The Pharisees and rulers looked for him to come, hoping for an opportunity to condemn him. They anxiously inquired, "Where is he?" But no one knew. The thought of him was uppermost in all minds. Through fear of the priests and rulers, none dared acknowledge him as the Messiah. But everywhere there was quiet yet earnest discussion concerning him. Many defended him as one sent from God, while others denounced him as a deceiver of the people. So was Jesus a faithful feast keeper? I wouldn't say that he was a faithful feast keeper. When he did attend the feast, what was the purpose of attending the feasts? The purpose was evangelistic, to attract attention to himself. Even when he was 12 years old at the temple, you remember that his family left without him, and 3 days later they discover, our son is not with us. So they go back to Jerusalem. They're looking for him all over the place, and suddenly they come and they find him in the temple dialoguing with all of the PhDs. And we're told in the Gospel of Luke, where this is recorded, that he amazed the religious leaders by his questions. What do you suppose his questions were? Now, you folks say that the Messiah is supposed to come, and he's supposed to destroy the Romans, and he's going to sit on the throne in Jerusalem, and he's going to place the Jewish nation at the apex of civilization again. What do you do with Isaiah 53? How do we understand? And he was sincere. You know, he didn't come across as arrogant, like he knew more than they. Ellen White describes it in Desire of Ages. He's sincerely asking. And the religious leaders say, we don't know. We have no answer to that question. So even when he was 12, which would be his bar mitzvah, if you please, he is already attracting attention to whom? He's attracting attention to himself as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Undoubtedly, he left in the minds of the religious leaders many questions that perhaps some of them looked for the answer for, and some of them perhaps accepted Jesus. Because we know in Acts chapter 6, verse 7, it says that many of the priests obeyed the faith. So the seeds that Jesus planted undoubtedly bore fruit. Now, I need to deal with two other points before we bring this to a close. Ellen White and the Feast of Tabernacles. There is no evidence that Ellen White kept the feasts. I know that there are little indications here, you know, that people, that feast keepers use to try and prove that Ellen White kept the feasts. For example, she speaks about a certain place where she went, and she says, we kept the fast. So immediately, they say, see, she kept the fast. And fasting had to do with the feast on the Day of Atonement. But when you read the context, they were fasting on that Sabbath for a particular historical reason. They were not celebrating the feasts. But because she speaks of the fast, and there was a fast during the feasts, see, Ellen White was a feast keeper. But there is no explicit reference in the writings of Ellen White that Ellen White regularly kept all of the feasts. She simply did not. Neither did all of the pioneers. But some use this statement that we already analyzed, but it would be a good idea for us to take a look at it again because, some people will be watching this presentation that did not watch the first one. They use a statement in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 540 and 541, where Ellen White seems to indicate that we are required to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, I might say that the Feast of Tabernacles is the only feast that has not yet been fully fulfilled. It's in the future. When is the Feast of Tabernacles going to be celebrated by God's people? We studied this. It's going to be celebrated when God's people travel for 7 days to heaven, and then the 8th day, this is, the Bible doesn't say this, the Spirit of Prophecy does say 7 days of travel to heaven. On the 8th day will be the great day of the feast, if you please. And that table will be set up, the welcome table, where you have all of these wonderful Fresno agricultural products. Now, I like to think that maybe Indiana corn might be on there too, because Indiana corn is delicious, among the best corn I've ever had in my life. And maybe papayas and mangoes and other kinds of fruit, because Ellen White says other kinds of fruit. But it's interesting that Ellen White would refer to the very fruit that was harvested in Israel at the end of the year, because Tabernacles was to commemorate the harvest of the fruit. So she would use almonds and pomegranates, and she would use grapes and olives, etc. Now let's read this statement that's found in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 540 and 541. At these yearly assemblies, the hearts of old and young would be encouraged in the service of God, while the association of the peoples from the different quarters of the land would strengthen the ties that bound them to God and to one another. So she's talking about the Feast of Tabernacles. And then she states this: well, would it be, is this a command? Is she saying, you must keep the Feast of Tabernacles? No. She says, well, would it be. Does that make it optional? Of course it makes it optional. Well, would it be for the people of God at the present time to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles? No. She says, well, would it be for the people of God at the present time to have a Feast of Tabernacles, a joyous commemoration of the blessings of God to them. Now let me stop there for a moment. Can we keep the Feast of Tabernacles like the Jews kept the Feast of Tabernacles? Why not? Because they kept the Feast of Tabernacles after the Day of Atonement was finished. And they commemorated the ingathering of the fruit harvest and their settlement in the land of Canaan. Are we settled in Canaan? Are we literal Israelites? Do we all gather in the grapes and the olives, etc.? No. You see, the Feast of Tabernacles, in its historical application, was rooted to the Jewish nation. If we keep it not to commemorate a Jewish event, the settling in the land, but it will be the settling in the land of what? Of the heavenly Canaan. At least not the settling, but the being in tents for the final settlement here on planet Earth. So she continues writing, well would it be for the people of God at the present time to have a Feast of Tabernacles, a joyous commemoration of the blessings of God to them. As the children of Israel celebrated the deliverance that God had wrought for their fathers and His miraculous preservation of them during their journeyings from Egypt, so should we gratefully call to mind the various ways He has devised for bringing us out from the world and from the darkness of error into the precious light of His grace and truth. So, are we to understand this statement from Ellen White as a mandate to observe the Feast of Tabernacles? Absolutely not. And how do God's people celebrate the yearly Feast of Tabernacles today? How do conferences celebrate this? Conferences celebrate this by having camp meetings. That's the place to remember the blessings of God in the previous year. It's the time to study the Word of God together. It's the time to sing and to praise the Lord. Camp meetings would be the occasions that Ellen White mentions here, where well it would be for the people of God at the present time to have a Feast of Tabernacles. And by the way, the pioneers probably could understand what Ellen White was saying a little bit better than us. Because really what they would do is they would pitch this huge tent. And then individuals will also bring their tents, and they would pitch their tents around the place where the camp meeting was taking place. And so really it was kind of like a feast of booths. It was like a feast of tabernacles where you have all these people camping in tents, and staying in other people's houses, because Adventists would invite other Adventists that lived in the area. And so they would all come and they would live in these provisional places, and then after the glorious celebration, they would go home. It kind of reminds me of Soquel here in Central California. I worked with the locating crew for the better part of the years that I spent here. And I'll tell you, that was a real job. Sometimes the first several days we would work as many as 18 hours from dawn till dusk, locating people where they were supposed to pitch their tent, the cabin where they were supposed to stay at. We would actually also help them pitch their tents. They all came from all over Central California, all over the United States, not only Central Cal, all over the United States. Soquel attracts people who have been coming. I think of Jane Johnson, over 50 years going to Soquel. And so people spend there, it begins on a Thursday night, and they stay for almost 10 days till not the following Sabbath, but the Sabbath after. And I'll tell you what, to be honest with you, after the 10 days, I'm ready to go home. I'm ready to go to my permanent home because I had to stay in the girls' dorm, and I had to travel back and forth. It was a rat race. Well, yeah, in the girls' dorm it was nice, but it was vacation time. The girls weren't there. So it was okay. So anyway, camp meeting at Soquel reminds me of the celebration of the Feast of Tabernacles, where everybody leaves home, they go to camp meeting, they sing, they celebrate, they study the Word, they fellowship with one another, they thank the Lord for all the blessings that the Lord has poured out, and then Ellen White says that at the end of the Feast of Tabernacles, the people were wiped out. That's not her expression, but that's the idea that she gives. They were wiped out, and everybody was joyful and happy, but they were ready to go home. Now let's go to the last point here in this section of the syllabus. None of our pioneers, including Ellen White, ever commanded to observe the feasts. By the way, that would include some great scholars that we had in our church. Uriah Smith. It would include what I consider to be the best scholar in the history of the Adventist Church, J.N. Andrews. This was a fellow who really knew his Bible. He had the New Testament memorized. He was like a Randy Skeet. Who can stand and he can rattle off the verses without a single note. I will only be able to do that in eternity when the Lord gives me a photographic memory. But none of our pioneers or Ellen White is there any evidence that the feasts are supposed to be kept. None of the writings of the pioneers tell us to keep the feasts. You see, folks, feast keeping distracts the remnant church from its unique mission. The unique mission is to preach the three angels' messages to the world. It's hard enough for people to embrace the Sabbath because other Christians say it's Jewish. It becomes almost overwhelming to them when they are told that they must keep the feasts as well. Then they have a right to really consider us Jewish. We certainly can prove to them that the Sabbath was made at the beginning and applies to the entire human race. But we cannot do so with the feasts. The Bible clearly teaches that the feasts were given specifically to the Jews at Mount Sinai to foreshadow future events. They commemorate events of Jewish history and look forward to the coming of the Messiah. So for all of these reasons that we've analyzed in the syllabus, I believe that we are not commanded to keep the feasts. there are some individuals in the Adventist church who take advantage of the season of these feasts to have a little commemoration. And like I say, I'm not going to be a judge to tell them, don't do that. Where I draw the line is when the feast keepers say, you must keep the feasts, and if you don't keep the feasts, it's a matter of salvation. You could be lost. Where they say that the observance of the feast is as important as the observance of the seventh-day Sabbath. The final crisis is not going to have to do with whether you keep the feast or not. The final crisis has to do with the seal of God and the mark of the beast. And we all know that the seal of God is the seventh-day Sabbath. Observing the seventh-day Sabbath with all of our heart, understanding its true meaning. And we all know that the mark of the beast, no one has received it yet, but the mark of the beast will be given to those who have full knowledge that the Sabbath is God's day of rest, and yet to be able to buy or sell, in order to not lose their lives, they will go against their conscience and they will say, I choose to keep Sunday anyway. And then there will be those who are deceived, who are self-deceived, that will not look at any of the evidence. So the final division of the human race does not have to do with whether you celebrate the feasts or not. The final crisis has to do with the seal of God and the mark of the beast. And by the way, that is the third angel's message. Let's not get distracted into side issues. Let's remember that the reason for the existence of the Seventh-day Adventist Church is to preach the three angels' messages of Revelation chapter 14. Fear God and give glory to Him, for the hour of His judgment has come, and worship Him who made the heavens, the earth, the seas, and the fountains of waters. Also the second message, calling those who are in Babylon to come out of Babylon and to embrace the truth as it is in Jesus. And then the third angel's message, which is the most solemn, which says, if you choose to stay in Babylon, you will receive the mark of the beast, and the wrath of God will destroy those who receive the mark of the beast. So let's stick to what we're supposed to be doing and not get distracted into all of these side issues. Let's not keep the lunar Sabbath, which is keeping a counterfeit Sabbath just as much as keeping Sunday as the Sabbath. And of course, that will be the subject of study for our last session in our next class.